A hall in a Chinese city, 1853. Sealed papers, rows of desks, an invigilator walking the aisles. This is the Imperial Civil Service examination, and this is the Taiping Rebellion. The Confucian classics are banned in this city, so the questions are on Christian scripture. And in a separate hall that year, the candidates are women. That is the name it carries in English. And rebellion already decides something. It presumes which side was the legitimate government. Two of the leading historians of this war, Stephen Platt and Tobie Meyer-Fong, have both argued that the more accurate word is civil war, because what ran that examination was not a mob. It was a state with its own calendar, its own land law, its own printed scripture, and its own ranked kings sitting on the richest region in China. The war ran 14 years. The state ran 11 of them from a capital. And here is the argument up front. Destroying that state did not save the empire that beat it. It changed what kind of empire it was. It is stranger than you think. Where did it come from? Not from the man whose name is on it. Hong Xiuquan had the revelation. His school friend built the movement, assembling a congregation in the hills of Guangxi called God-Worshipping Society. Thousands of members, then tens of thousands, most of them Hakka. In Guangxi in the 1840s, disputes over land and water between Hakka communities and longer-settled neighbors were constant and frequently armed. He was not recruiting in a quiet countryside. The province was already fighting. And then the decision that dooms the project from the inside. Two followers begin falling into trance and speaking not about God, but as God. One is the Father, one is Jesus. Hong ratifies it. In his own theology, he is the second son, and the Father outranks the Son. So he hands a charcoal seller, the man they will call the East King, the theological veto over the heavenly king himself. That bill comes due in 6 years. On the 11th of January, 1851, at Jintian village, perhaps 10,000 people proclaimed the heavenly kingdom of great peace, with Hong as its heavenly king. 2 years later, they had a capital. Nanjing dies Hadal in March 1853, after 13 days to gunpowder mines dug under the wall. Inside the city stood a second, smaller walled city, the Banner Garrison Quarter, where the Qing garrison and their families lived. Its population was killed after the city fell. The figures in the sources are estimates and round ones. They renamed the city Tianjin, the heavenly capital, and then they did something rebels had done before, but never quite like this. Rebels had founded dynasties. One founded the Ming in 1368. What nobody had done was govern with a different calendar, a different scripture, and a different examination syllabus. They did not capture the machine. They replaced it. Rank came first. Above everyone, the heavenly king, who turned a provincial governor's office into a palace, vanished into it, and ruled for 11 years by proclamation on yellow silk. Below him, kings by the compass points, east, west, south, north, and a flank king. Rank was legible at a glance. The color of the silk, the number of men allowed by law to carry your sedan chair, the gongs that announced which king was coming. Say you are the woman at that desk. Your street kneels and turns away as a king passes, and you hear him before you see him. A movement that abolished the old hierarchy, built a new one, in silk, and wrote all of it down. Almost none of it survived contact with the countryside, and the gap between the two is where this state actually lived. In 1853, they published the land system of the Heavenly Dynasty. Everything in the next 30 seconds is what the document says, not what happened. On paper, private landholding abolished, land redistributed by head count, men and women counted the same. Allocations deliberately mixed, half good ground and half bad. 25 households to a unit, under one officer, with 1 granary and 1 chapel. Every family to keep 5 hens and 2 hogs. Surplus, harvest to the state store, out of which weddings and funerals were paid, so money could play no part in arranging a marriage. So you live in one of those blocks of 25, and you keep 5 hens and 2 hogs, because the law says so. Except that you probably don't. The editors of the Standard English translation say flatly that it was not carried out. 14 years of war left no space for a land survey. In practice, the landlords the Taiping had abolished on paper were still there, still collecting, now stamping their ledgers with a Taiping seal. Some of it, though, was enforced absolutely, and that part tells you who these people were. There was a common treasury, into which recruits surrendered their possessions. Opium, alcohol, tobacco, gambling, and prostitution were banned. So were polygamy and concubinage, for everyone except the kings, who kept large households. A rule that binds everyone except the men who write it is still a rule. Note which ones bent at the top. Men and women were separated into camps, and not just soldiers, married couples. For roughly 2 years, until about 1855, a husband and wife in the heavenly capital could speak at a distance but not live together. Under the Taiping Code, all of these were capital offenses. Foot-binding was banned. Historians generally connect that to the leadership's own background rather than doctrine. It was not practiced in Hakka communities. The Taiping wrote one community's existing custom into law for everyone. So you have not lived with your husband in 2 years. That is also the law. Meanwhile, the charcoal seller runs this city day to day, and he is about to remember that he outranks God's second son. They threw out the classics, replaced the calendar with one of their own, ran their own printing operation, and issued their own authorized scripture with the heavenly king's annotations in it. And they kept exactly one institution from the old world, the one that had rejected their founder 4 times. The examination system stayed. The syllabus became his revelation. He rebuilt the thing that broke him and made himself the answer key. Taiping sources record women sitting those examinations. The evidence is thin and late, reported rather than documented, but no Chinese state had recorded it before. The man who wrote that syllabus had sat the entry-level examination 4 times and failed 4 times. After the 3rd failure, he was ill for weeks and saw things he could not explain. At the time, to him, an illness he had recovered from and nothing more. 6 years later, a Christian pamphlet, handed to him outside an examination hall and never properly read, told him what he had seen. The old man was God the Father. The younger man was Jesus, and that made him the second son. The vision came first. The meaning arrived late, out of a leaflet. He later went to study with an American Baptist missionary in Canton, who never baptized him, and no mission church ever admitted him. That is the entire biography, and it is not the interesting part. What got built is, the last piece arrives in 1859, when Hong's cousin walks into the capital after 6 years in Hong Kong among missionaries. He is made prime minister within weeks and hands over a treatise proposing railways, newspapers, and a patent office. It reads like a document from 30 years later. Most of it is what China's reformers would be proposing after 1870, written inside a besieged capital by the prime minister of the losing side. What matters is not that it was the best plan in China, but that it existed there at all. Almost none of it was built. You cannot lay track through a siege, so why couldn't the empire crush this? Its armies were the wrong shape. The 8 banners and the Green Standard Army were garrison forces, hereditary, scattered across hundreds of posts, designed to hold towns and police roads, poorly paid, never meant to maneuver as a field army across half a continent. The imperial siege camp outside the heavenly capital was destroyed by the defenders, rebuilt, and destroyed again. The dynasty's professional army could not blockade one city. What nearly finished the Taiping was the Taiping. In September 1856, the bill came due. The charcoal seller, speaking as God the Father, for when Ward the heavenly king to address him as sovereign, Hong summoned another king back to the capital. Over that autumn, the movement destroyed its own leadership, its best administrator, then the man who had removed him. The following spring, its ablest field commander walked out with an army and never returned. Later Taiping and Qing accounts put the dead from the thousands into the tens of thousands, accounts written afterwards by interested parties, not registers and unverified. What is not in doubt is who was killed. Of the original 5 kings, 2 had died in battle, 2 were killed by their own side, and 1 deserted. The dynasty did none of that. The dynasty still had to win, and to win it improvised. Zheng Guofan, a scholar official at home in mourning, was told to organize local militia and instead built a standing army, the Shang army, on one principle. He picked his commanders. Each commander recruited his own men, usually from his own county, and often his own lineage. A battalion was loyal to the man who raised it. Remove that man and it dissolved. His protege, Li Hongzhang, did the same thing in Anhui and called it the Huai army. Then the foreigners, and let's be exact, because this is where popular accounts overstate. Shanghai was a treaty port with the war burning around it. An American adventurer recruited a force off the waterfront in 1860. Later titled the Ever-Victorious Army, it passed after his death to a British officer, Charles Gordon. 5,000 men at its peak, overwhelmingly Chinese soldiers under foreign officers, operating within 30 miles of one city under Li Hongzhang's orders, disbanded in the spring of 1864, 2 months before Nanjing fell. It mattered. It decided nothing. What the foreigners supplied was money and machinery, and Britain, having just fought the Qing in the Second Opium War, decided, after 1860, that its treaty rights were worth more from a surviving Qing government than from a new one. Platt's argument, and it explains the whole reversal, which brings us to the money. And this is where the war stops being a war and starts being a change of state. In 1853, a mid-ranking official near Yangzhou needed cash and began taxing goods in transit through the market towns at 1%, reportedly without asking his superior. The court legalized it afterwards, and it spread. It was called Legible, and settled at roughly 2 to 10% on goods moving between provinces and on shops. Deng funded his army from commercial tolls raised in his own province, money that never touched Beijing. Li funded his from Shanghai, Lijin, and whatever share of the customs a governor could get his hands on. One caveat for later, because it matters. The maritime customs at that same port was sending money north the whole time. The last stretch of this war was not decided by a battle. It was decided by digging. An Qing sat upriver of the heavenly capital and controlled whether it could be fed. Deng's younger brother moved on it in the summer of 1860, had it ringed by autumn, and for a year did not storm it. He dug rings of trench and wall, one facing the city, one facing outward against relief. A river flotilla cut resupply by water, and when Zheng learned that foreign merchants were selling rice into the city, he got the British minister in Peking to shut that traffic down. A siege inside a Chinese civil war, tightened in part by a diplomat agreeing to stop the rice boats. The city fell in September 1861. Then Suzhou, 2 years later, handed over rather than stormed. Subordinate commanders turned on their own general and opened the gates, with Gordon personally guaranteeing their lives. Li Hongzhang had them executed. His stated reason was that the men had kept their troops under arms and were demanding commands and territory of their own. Gordon considered the guarantee his. He refused the imperial reward of 10,000 taels of silver and withdrew his force from the war for 2 months. After Suzhou, surrender was no longer an exit, which is why the capital had to be starved instead. On the 2nd of March, 1864, the ring closed, and nothing entered the city again. The Heavenly King died in the palace that June. Illness, poison, or his own hand. Every account of it reaches us through the people who killed everyone else in that room. In July, a tunnel under the wall did what a tunnel had done to the Banner Quarter 11 years earlier. 11 years and 4 months of government ended by the same trick that started it. And the war took another 7 years to finish dying. The last Taiping army was destroyed on the Hunan-Guizhou-Guangxi border in August 1871. The loyal king, captured, was ordered to write an account of the war and produced roughly 50,000 characters in a matter of days. Zheng Guofan cut it before forwarding it to Beijing. Something like 27 or 28,000 went north. The arithmetic is approximate. The censorship is not, and the deleted passages surfaced in 1944 in Zheng's own former house. Our fullest account of the Taiping from the inside reaches us in the handwriting of a prisoner, corrected by the man who destroyed him. And then the whole Jiangsu, Zhejiang, and Anhui took the worst of it, with Jiangxi and Hubei behind. You will see figures attached to this. 20 to 30 million is the standard range in English. The higher number you sometimes meet, around 73 million, comes from a Chinese demographic study published in 2001, and it measures population loss, not deaths. Treat it as a ceiling, not a body count, because nobody counted. No census, no burial registry, no casualty return. These are subtractions. How many people the state believed lived in China before, minus how many could be found after. They include people who fled and settled elsewhere, children never born, and deaths a decade later in a countryside the war had emptied. The measuring window contains 3 other rebellions and a famine. Meyer-Fong, the most careful historian of this war's human cost, says even an approximate count is impossible. Tens of millions of people are missing from the record. Most of them died, and the consensus direction is that starvation and disease killed far more than fighting did. But nobody can give you the split. A gap in a ledger is not a grave, and we will never know which it was. So, what winning cost? 2 things damage my own argument, and they go first. Take them before you take anything else. The strongest objection is that none of this was new. Local elites had been raising their own troops since the White Lotus Rising, half a century earlier. The war accelerated a habit. It did not invent one. The court also never lost the lever that actually mattered. It could still appoint, transfer, and dismiss every governor in China. In the same decades built the throne a brand new income stream that did reach Beijing, the Maritime Customs Service. This is not a story of a state bleeding out. The Qing lasted another 47 years, and there is a name for what it did with the first 15 of them: the Tongji Restoration. A foreign office in 1861, foreign language schools in 1862, arsenals, the Fuzhou Naval Dockyard in 1866, a navy, and a decade-long campaign to retake its northwestern territories. That is not a corpse. Provincial capacity made 1911 possible. It did not cause it. And Meyer-Fong objects to the shape of the argument itself. Reading this war as a stage on the road to 1911 is a frame imposed afterwards. Nobody in 1864 was living through a prologue. Take her seriously, and everything I am about to say is a use we make of other people's catastrophe, and should be said in that tone of voice. The second concession is the bigger one. In August 1864, weeks after the greatest military victory of the century, Zheng Guofan began dismantling his own army. Something like 120,000 men sent home. He had applied for sick leave in May and told his brother privately that the illness was a pretext. He wanted somewhere to hide from people who had noticed how powerful he had become. The most powerful soldier in China disbanded his forces because the throne's displeasure was still fatal. That is not a warlord. That refutes the strong version of everything I am about to say, and you should hold it in your hand while I say it, because 2 things outlived everyone in this story. The army Li Hongzhang refused to disband, which lasted as long as the dynasty did, fought the Sino-French and Sino-Japanese wars, and whose line runs straight into the Beiyang army. And a 1% toll, invented by an official who did not ask permission, still being collected in 1931, 20 years after the dynasty, it rescued had ceased to exist, and set, staffed, and largely kept in the provinces. Across the second half of the century, the empire's tax base shifted decisively off land and onto commerce. Winning did not kill the Qing. Winning changed what kind of state the Qing was. To survive, the dynasty had to let other men raise its armies and collect its money, and it never fully took either back. One other number is certain. Shanghai grew because people with money ran into the foreign settlements and built there, which leaves the hall, the desks, the sealed papers, The scripture where the classic should be, and the woman sitting an examination. No Chinese state had ever recorded a woman sitting. Whatever else that was, it was a government. And in English, we still call it a rebellion.